because we're tired of being unemployed and underemployed. We are tired of only having to engage in sex work. We are tired of being your outreach people and your peer navigators making $10 to $12 an hour. We are tired of fighting for our country on foreign soil and then being told that we are no longer fit to serve. We are tired of our murders going without any justice and our murderers out there free. We want to be free. And that's why we are here.
Well, hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for this panel focused on the National Trans Visibility March and looking at the intersection of the criminal justice system and law enforcement and our transgender community. My name is Josh Bell. I'm the Executive Director of One Orlando Alliance, and it's my privilege to be here as a moderator for this conversation. Obviously, this intersection has been historically highly problematic and harmful. Our transgender community has been harmed repeatedly by law enforcement and the criminal justice system. And so as we look to the historical realities and also consider our present day needs and the ways that our community needs to be better supported, I am so grateful for the amazing panel that's come together to have this conversation. And now we're going to go around and they're going to introduce themselves, starting with Dominique.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Dominique Morgan. My pronouns are she and her. I am the Executive Director of Black and Pink National. We're currently the largest prison abolitionist organization in the country, centering the needs of those who identify as LGBTQ+ and living with HIV and AIDS. I'm also a person who spent nearly a decade navigating the adult prison system and understand these deep intersections in our communities. I'm really excited to be here with you all as a Nebraskan to join this conversation.
Thank you, Dominique. Gina?
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Gina Duncan, speaking to you from Asheville, North Carolina, where I recently relocated. I am the former Director of Transgender Inclusion at Equality Florida, the state's largest LGBTQ civil rights organization. I now am the CEO of Duncan Global Inclusion Group, which is the consulting group working with major corporations to bring transgender cultural competency to them. I have had the good fortune of working with several of the panelists here, as well as with the Department of Justice in updating and bringing inclusive and affirming transgender policy to law enforcement agencies, not only in Florida, but across the country. And I look forward to speaking more about that as we go forward. So thank you for having me.
Thank you so much, Gina. Nathan?
Good morning. My name is Nathan Broomer. I use he, him pronouns. I am a Floridian through and through. I'm talking to you from St. Petersburg, Florida right now, and I'm happy to be here. I have been a community advocate and a trans advocate, well, pretty much my whole life. I'm currently serving as Commissioner Nikki Freed's LGBTQ consumer advocate here in the state of Florida for the Florida Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services. My intersection in working with law enforcement, frankly, began as a teenager through unfortunate interactions when I was misgendered, and continued and sort of drove and motivated me through my career development as a teacher, and then eventually going to law school and training, fortunately more than once with Gina, often with law enforcement and first responders. Although not currently practicing, I may continue to practice at some point. Really, advocacy has been a prime focus. So as Dominique mentioned, I'm really interested in discussing the work at the intersections across criminal justice more broadly today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nathan. Chris.
Hi, I'm Chris Tatum. I'm a lieutenant with the Orange County Sheriff's Office, and I also serve as one of the LGBTQ liaisons for the Sheriff's Office, helping to create and modify policies to address some of the issues that we have had in the past in dealing with not only the LGBTQ community, but more specifically with the transgender community. Pronouns are he, him, and his. And in addition to that, I also, as an attorney, serve as the general counsel for the Gay Officers Action League of Central Florida, which serves to bring LGBTQ liaisons not just to the larger law enforcement organizations, but all law enforcement organizations within Central Florida.
Thank you so much, Chris. And Fred?
Good afternoon. My name is Fred Lawton. I use the pronouns he, him. I am a mediator at Upchurch, Watson, White & Max, which is a civil mediation firm. We're headquartered in Maitland, but we have 6 offices in Florida. Before I joined that firm in January of 2020, I was a judge on the bench in the 9th Judicial Circuit. That's Orange and Osceola County. I was a judge for 26 years, 7 years as a county judge, and 19 years as a circuit judge. The last 5 years, I was the chief judge of the circuit, so I succeeded Belvin Perry when he retired. Chief judge is sort of the administrative officer for a discrete court system, the Ninth Circuit. Prior to that, I was a prosecutor for 11 years at the state attorney's office, so I have about 45 plus years in court or law enforcement experience, and obviously there's an intersection between today's topic, which is about criminal justice, both the law enforcement aspect of it and then the court aspect of it. I'm here to share some thoughts. Mostly I'm here to learn, and I'm looking forward to the conversation. So thanks.
Thank you, Fred. And I just want to thank all of you for bringing your depth of experience to this conversation. This is such an important topic, and the National Trans Visibility March has been focused on raising the visibility of our transgender community, and along with that, the safety of our transgender community. And that's not just physical safety, though that's part of it, but things like how do the systems that we encounter on a day-to-day basis, how are these systems equipped to, or not equipped, to be sensitive and to be appropriate with folks. And so obviously there have been historic issues. Obviously there have been things that have not been right and not been helpful and not been, or that have actually been very harmful. And so we're going to start with talking about some of those historic and ongoing issues. And so Gina's going to lead us off with sharing a little bit about that.
Thank you, Josh. This issue has been certainly a long-term issue and a very pervasive issue impacting the transgender and non-binary communities. I want to take us back perhaps to a starting point of 2018. In 2018, as you might know, Florida was the epicenter of anti-transgender murders, with 5 transgender women being murdered in the state of Florida. We have seen over the years, as we commemorate the Transgender Day of Remembrance, that more and more transgender Americans are being slaughtered every year. We're now in the 40s. I remember starting in doing this work, we would have alarmingly around 30 transgender women murdered, usually transgender women of color, very similar patterns. And now we're in the 40s in reference to transgender murders occurring in the United States. Sadly, in most of these cases in 2018, none were solved. The victims were misgendered. They were usually Black transgender women or transgender women of color. And we saw a number of gaps in reference to the way law enforcement responded. They would misgender the victim to the media, and then the media would pick up on the story, and then law enforcement would become the story instead of the horrific murder of another transgender woman. And then this evolved to last summer when we had the Black Lives Matter movement and protests and rallies, and transgender people were being arrested all over the country and being detained and arrested and being mistreated while they were detained. So there's a overriding issue here in 2 ways. Number one, a basic cultural competency of understanding the transgender community and meeting the transgender community where they are, treating people with dignity and respect if they are detained. And then the second piece is more the criminal justice area in reference to how do we stem this horrific increase of violence against transgender Floridians and Americans that seems to escalate every year? Can we put more teeth into the hate crime statute, for example? It doesn't have gender identity in the hate crime statute in the state of Florida. How do we, prevent this? How do we create more of a deterrent to stop these murders? So that's kind of the foundational piece. There's a lot there, but these are issues that are ongoing.
Yeah, thank you for that, Gina. I appreciate that so much. And Dominique, you've definitely experienced all of the things that Gina has talked about. And would you be willing to share kind of on the historic and ongoing issues that you've experienced and see?
Yeah. From a personal experience, as someone who navigated the juvenile system from the age of 13 to 17, a year of survival sex work and homelessness, and then sentenced to 8 to 16 years in prison in the adult system in Nebraska, 18 months of that in solitary confinement under the Prison Rape Elimination Act, 6 months of that actually living on death row due to the system's overcrowding, living next door to John Lotter, who killed Brandon Tina, one of the most significantly known stories of harm of trans people from my home state, right? And then this journey to being the executive director of Black and Pink and identifying as an abolitionist and doing strong work to divest from seeing the threat of incarceration of people as a deterrent for people not to treat other folks with respect and love. And so I think from a historic standpoint, and I think from now, there are people based on where you at. Like I sit in as a Black trans woman with the identities I carry that are centered in harm and much oppression in our communities. Dominique Morgan sits in a lot of space of privilege and access as a degreed Black trans woman, as a Black trans woman who has a job, making over a certain amount of money. So in what I'm about to say, I want to acknowledge for many folks, this idea of policing and implementing identity and so on and so forth in some of these laws feels like safety. And whatever a person feels they need to have to feel safe, I believe they should have it. I will also offer that there are identities that are laced in some of these laws where Black people are allegedly protected as an identity based on the race, and that hasn't prevented us from being murdered and killed and harmed. And so I want us to think about what is the community activation piece to really dismantle transphobia, homophobia, to think about even within queer spaces where you have so many Black and brown queer folks who think being in very queer spaces makes us safer, but you have white queer folks who think that their queerness absolves them from racism and their biases. I think I want to see more of that work happening amongst us, because that will allow us, again, I don't believe in laws making me safer. I believe that safer human beings make safer communities. And at the same time, I believe we should give people space and opportunity and autonomy to activate, especially based on regions, right? From Nebraska, I'm not seeing numbers of people who are murdered in the streets every day, but you're seeing in Dallas, in Florida, in Chicago, in DC, it's different. So we need to listen to folks who are on the ground who are telling us what they need. But also you look from Marsha P. Johnson to Sylvia Rivera to Miss Major to Aria Saeed to Mariah Moore. All of these folks, we're constantly talking about how do we make people see us as human beings? And much of the murder that's happening is that they don't think our humanity is real. A law doesn't make people see a human as a human. A law doesn't position people that if a person is doing sex work and they're murdered while they're engaging in sex work, that it doesn't mean that their murder wasn't wrong because they were engaging in sex work. To uplift some of the things that Gina said around misgendering folks and around the erasure of a person's existence. We have girls who we aren't even able to know who they are because they won't use the name that the world knows them as. And so you have folks who we haven't even had the time to grieve them because the media, because mainstream spaces have been so hungry to misgender them and erase their name, whether it's on their ID or their social security card or otherwise. So community is a huge piece of this. Love, and it seems very Pollyanna, but I have to believe in it. Love of each other, centering each other, seeing each other, disagreeing with love, disagreeing with still the idea that we can have community and not agree on all topics is something that I believe will push us in a direction that centers health and safety of Black and brown trans folks just as much and possibly even more than laws and policing in some ways.
Dominique, thank you for that. That's so powerful, and your personal experience is so so informative to me. And I own my own privilege, white cisgender gay man. Like I've got plenty of things that insulate me from those kinds of experiences, and I appreciate your willingness to share what you've been through, what you see, and where you're working. Fred, in terms of the judiciary and your experience on the bench, what kind of conversations have you been privy to around this?
You know, I started in a courtroom in 1982, then as a prosecutor, and then 26 years presiding over a courtroom. And a courtroom should be a space of equal justice. It should be a space of equal application of the law. It should be a space of respect for all humans, dignity for human life, and respect for the dignity of every human being. Has that always been true? Of course not. But there has been slow progress. The courts are pretty slow to evolve on social issues, in my opinion. So we're usually a little bit behind where we ought to be. Excuse me. Part of that might be how we are selected to be judges. So the trial judges in Florida are elected. The appellate judges are appointed. About 50% of the judges in Florida have been initially appointed to the trial bench because of an opening. Depending upon who the governor is, you'll get a certain type of appointee to the bench. Right now, we have a very conservative governor who looks for people who belong to the Federalist Society and share his conservative philosophy. I think maybe my computer's freezing up for a sec here. Can you hear me?
We can still hear you. You're good.
It's kind of bad timing. Can you hear me, Josh?
Yes.
About 50% of the judges have been appointed. Right now, we have a pretty conservative governor who's appointing political conservatives to the bench, and that has an impact. And while politics should be removed from the application of law, I mean, you're dealing with people with a certain philosophy and outlook. The governor gets to make those appointments, but the result is what type of person do you have presiding in the courtroom, and that does have an impact. The Supreme Court has policies and guidelines for judges, and respect for human dignity is one of them, and treating people equally is another. And that's one of our goals. The courtroom is presided over by human beings. Sometimes we fail in the delivery of that, but it is one of our policies. At some point, we can talk about discretionary versus non-discretionary sentencing in Florida. One of the evolutions over time, since I started as a prosecutor and then as a judge, is that the legislature has removed a fair amount of discretionary sentencing from judges and imposed mandatory sentences for certain offenses. And so no matter who's up there and no matter what their philosophy is, the judge's hands are tied, and that power is predominantly handed over to the prosecutor. And I was a prosecutor once. We also live in a state with a very conservative legislature, and the laws that we apply are written by that body, and under the separation of powers, it really is inappropriate for a judge to override the law that adopted by the legislature, but we're in a pretty conservative state in that regard. So the laws that are adopted have come from a legislature that's been dominated by one party for a long, long time, and that also has an impact. So we can discuss all or any of those items as we proceed. I asked Gina before we went on the air if she's had an opportunity to exclusively educate judges about today's issues. And I think that is an area that could use some focus. I know law enforcement has been trained and educated. I don't know that judges themselves have received enough education. I don't think they have about these issues. Even the use of pronouns is sometimes foreign to judges. Terms, I think I'm sure that there are some judges who don't even understand some of the terms like cisgender. I know there are colleagues who go, what does that mean? And so there's lots of work to be done in terms of language. There's lots of work to be done in terms of the intersection of issues that we're going to discuss today and judges in particular. And, at some point, I'm sure with Christopher and myself, we're going to talk about in the criminal justice system, the challenges of housing of inmates. That's a major issue right now in the criminal justice system. And I think the other major issue is judges being sensitive to, aware of, and educated in knowledge of the issues and how to talk to people. Because that's what we do. We talk to people every single day. That has a powerful impact about how someone feels in terms of the application of justice. There's work to be done there. The activists can really help the judicial system by training and educating judges as we go forward.
Might I offer quickly just a language piece, a great opportunity in the moment to do some language education. Incarcerated people is more people-centered. Being an inmate for me, I always wondered, when would I no longer be an inmate? It's really, really clear when you're no longer an incarcerated individual or person, especially because I know there's a lot of Black and Pink members who are tuning in right now. But thank you, Fred, for creating that space.
Thanks, Dominique. See, there's an example of we really need training in the judiciary about the use of language, which we are probably way behind where the community is. I think we really lag the community about use of language, so we need help there. So thanks.
Thank you, Fred, and thank you, Dominique. I appreciate both of you weighing in on that. And now we're gonna move over to Nathan. Am I in the right spot? Actually, Chris. So in terms of the training that's been mentioned and the policies that have been put in place, we know that locally there has been progress. So share with what's happening right now and how are we addressing these issues at Orange County Sheriff's Office?
So at the Orange County Sheriff's Office, I know one of the experiences that was televised that was very regrettable was we did have a murder in Central Florida where the victim of that crime was misgendered. At the time, the person providing that information simply just wasn't aware. The training wasn't there, the knowledge was not there, and it wasn't something that was done intentionally, but it was done, and obviously very regrettable afterwards. Since that time, the Sheriff's Office has taken, especially under the new sheriff, taken a big focus on trying to create policies that are very inclusive, not only for the community at large, but also within the Sheriff's Office itself. So I'll talk a little bit about both of those. One, we've adapted our policies and our procedures so that when we do have victims who are transgender, we are able to use that name or provide that name and information to the public during public records requests. We also, when dealing with victims, try to ask our deputies and detectives to ask that information up front if there is any confusion or if they feel like there might be an issue of misidentification in the initial report, for example, asking them, hey, pardon me, I think there might have been a mistake or, maybe there's some miscommunication. Can you provide me with your pronouns or what would you prefer to be called? Because unfortunately that does happen a little bit out on the street with our deputies dealing with victims and even witnesses and suspects. We've also changed a lot of our policies, especially when dealing with people who are within the transgender community, making sure that, for example, we try to have somebody who is the same gender or at least gender identity doing physical searches of people if possible. So that way there's less of a discomfort in that sense, or at least as little discomfort as there can be. Obviously, it is invasive being searched, but certain things do have to happen in our profession. So we try to make it as comfortable as we can. In addition, we try not to, in the past, there's been a policy of removing some of the things, like, for example, taking off or requiring somebody to change their clothing, or removing hair pieces or things of that nature that were done out in the street prior to the person going to a detention facility, which obviously is very embarrassing and really harms a transgender person, almost stripping them at least of a portion of their identity prior to them even getting to the booking center. So that's something that we've eliminated and tried to avoid. In addition to the changes that we've made in interacting with members of the transgender community in public, we've also made some changes within the agency, especially having somebody who works for us who is transgender, adapting simple policies such as our grooming policies, allowing somebody to deviate from the grooming policies depending on where they're at in their transitional phase, trying to be more accommodating and creating a space where people who are transgender can feel comfortable coming to work, being themselves, and doing work in law enforcement. That's also included changes to the way that we allow people to allow people to use bathrooms or use other facilities within the agency. So that way, again, everybody feels comfortable, regardless of how they identify, using the facility so that they're open to everyone else. But yeah, that's a lot of the progress that we've made, at least as far as policies and training here within Central. I know Gina's already talked about, she does training with law enforcement. The sheriff's office does that training. I know OPD does that training as well. So just having that training and educating our officers so they can do a better job when interacting with the public.
Thank you for that, Chris. And there was a question, I'm trying to weave in some of the questions that we're getting in the comments, but Mulan's question, what's being done to ensure that the officers are following these changes? And then I would say, if someone, a member of our transgender community, has an interaction with an officer and does not feel respected, safe, that kind of feeling that, you're trying to do your best in the process of enforcing the law, I guess. What do they do? Like, how does that get addressed? So
we do have two systems in place that we use in order to enforce these changes. One is random auditing that's done, and I call it that, but it's essentially what a supervisor will do, or what sometimes even myself as a manager will do, is actually physically go out on call. So we watch what the deputies are doing out in the field. At the same time, we also randomly audit some of the body-worn camera videos that we see. At any time, if we see anything that appears to be disrespectful to any member of the community, the supervisor addresses that issue. That's done through progressive discipline. So obviously a first infraction, we try to provide education and training to make sure that, the deputy understands this is what you did, or this is how it looked to the other person. So here's some ideas on how to create a more positive interaction and perhaps get a better result. Continued infractions obviously results in suspensions. If the person is just deliberately choosing not to follow it, that can actually lead up to more severe discipline, up to and potentially including termination if the infraction itself or if the number of infractions becomes significant. At the same time, we also rely on members of the community to come forward when they have those interactions, because our deputies are equipped with body-worn cameras and they are supposed to have them on. That allows us, once we receive a complaint about mistreatment, to review that, and we can definitively see, not just from the deputy side or even from the public side, but just the raw video, and that way we're able to make that determination of this could have been handled better. In addition to that, as a LGBTQ liaison, we make ourselves available to any of the supervisors so that they can better understand why someone might be complaining about something they may not understand. I know one complaint that a supervisor was trying to handle and just didn't understand was an inappropriate pronoun was used, and the deputy didn't understand why it was a big deal, and not even the supervisor understood, because they just didn't have that training and education at the time. So being able to step in and provide that and help them to understand it and correct the issue was important. But a lot of that started, or actually for that particular one, it did start by a complaint that was made to the sheriff's office, so that we knew that it was happening, because we may not see it during a random audit or just showing up on the scene.
Thank you for that context, Chris. We appreciate it. And Nathan, you've been involved in some of this Central Florida progress here. Would you care to
Sure.
chime in?
Yeah, both in Central Florida and beyond, actually. So Gina made reference to some of the impacts we saw through rallies and protests that happened around the state following the murder of George Floyd. We saw in a number of jurisdictions, actually, trans and non-binary folks being mistreated, often in jurisdictions with policies that at the time were trans inclusive. But as the lieutenant alluded to, right, you've got new officers, you've got training that was maybe done statically a number of years ago and hasn't been revisited. And so it's just not getting down and through all the layers of command. And some conversations ensued. I would say, as relevant to this conversation, some folks chose to have representation and are privately pursuing that through the criminal justice system. Other policies were reviewed. South Florida reviewed a number of policies. Other jurisdictions are looking at, how do we do the retraining? What's the next level training? Because, Gina and I were fortunate enough to train law enforcement years ago. I think it was 5 or 6 years ago now. And that was a lot of leadership, and it's tough to train everyone all the time. I've been impressed by seeing a lot of agencies motivated by the CALEA standards around recertification and doing DEI work. That's the Commission on Accreditation for Law Enforcement Agencies. I get a little nervous sometimes when folks say, well, the accreditation wants us to do equity work, but it has to be deeper. And I think the challenge, and I want to go back to something Dominique said earlier about acknowledging the importance of storytelling, and also reflect on a question in the chat. Our humanity is real. Our personal storytelling, when we come to and train law enforcement, it's critical that you have people from the community. So as a white, passing transgender man, I have a different level of privilege and layer of privilege, but also different fears that I have when I engage with law enforcement, or should I have been picked up at protests, what that experience would be like. And we had trans men and trans women and non-binary folks have very egregious experiences across the state, all specific to what should have been benign search policies, but turned into something much, much more horrific beyond what it should have been, in particular on the street. But the power of stories and what Dominique mentioned, if we are going to do deeper work and acknowledge what is the opportunity in partnering, and I think, as the lieutenant also alluded to, hoping to work with the community and expecting, which is a tough thing for some trans folks to hear, like, tell us when we're doing it wrong. I think our community would probably argue respectfully, we have been telling you there is a lack of trust. We have been reporting. And so we have to have community members. We have to have Black and brown trans women in particular at the table. I'm always willing to be a bridge as someone who has been in the criminal justice system to sort of say, like, here's a disconnect, but you need to hear their stories, because my story is not their story. So if we're looking at the greatest safety, fear, and concern, that's where it relates to. And then a subject matter expert. So if you have a law enforcement, liaison or a trainer that really understands, okay, we're having a bit of a disconnect. I think doing more as quickly as we can is this moment. And it's beyond just where we see interactions within the, criminal law or criminal cases or name change cases. I mean, Fred, a lot of lawyers and judges are doing great work because they're seeing clients come before them, but our interaction with the justice system goes far beyond just those areas of law. Sure. We need judges, we need representation, we need more trans officers willing to openly serve, we need more trans lawyers willing to be a part of the process. And all of those gaps, are opportunities for us to do the work more intentionally. But we got to start first with our humanity, our stories, and our safety, always in the conversation.
I would like to offer, and this hits on like everything folks have said, of officers, of training, of people who would like to go off of what Barbie said about whether it would be white folks or white passing folks or Black folks. I don't want us to lose the compounded barrier of being any of these identities, whether you're an officer, whether you're an attorney, whether you're a judge, whether you're a person being arrested, and being Black. Like, I like the whole work around BLM and Blackness and policing, right, doesn't dissipate when you add the layer of being Black and trans. It doesn't change. I have many friends who are Black. I'm sitting here looking at Christopher. I have many friends who are Black police officers, and we have real conversations about what is it like to really believe in this system and watch your people be harmed by this system and want to be a disruptor of that harm, and also seeing value in being a part of policing, right? Or judges or attorneys, Nathan, or educators, Gina, right? Like, this space around Blackness shifts the urgency. It shifts how people see you as a professional. To go to what Barbie said, you can be Black doing this education, but historically they don't want to compensate you. They want you to come tell your story, and they want to sit down and listen to your trauma porn about how you were beaten, how you were disrespected, but they don't want to pay you, right? They don't want to pay you commensurate to what they will pay a white passing person, right? Like, those are, no matter what we're talking about, we cannot lose the space where race compounds every piece of that experience. And so how do we look at this harm that's happening to trans and queer folks and how that hits on a cellular level for folks who are Black, for folks who are brown, for folks who are Latinx and may not, and English may not be their first language. Like, these additional barriers compound the impact. And that is what people are wondering, right? We know that there are white folks doing education, white trans folks who are attorneys. Why don't you see a lot of Black trans folks who are attorneys? Because a lot of Black trans folks don't get to go to college. Right. So they're not gonna get to go get their JD. And if they have their JD, they work for trans-led orgs and they're not funded or positioned to be able to pass the bar, right? I'm a Black trans woman with a master's degree from Georgetown. I run $1 million national company, right? I'm one of 5 Black trans women in this country who do this work. Global ambassador for Apple at Pride. And still, when I walk through TSA, none of that matters because they want to know what's under my wig. They want to understand why I'm tucked this way. And me walking around with my $5,000 Louis Vuitton bag through TSA, I still have that same fear of being a 19-year-old Black trans girl and getting pulled over. So what I'm seeing in the chat from mostly Black trans folks commenting on Facebook, sisters, we see y'all. And I think the conversation we need to have is, how do we position folks who are in a position of power to create space for these folks? And I think a lot of these folks are based in Florida, to see how they can be a part of creating change with you all. And what I will offer in the spirit of allyship, how do you support them in creating change that positions them to be compensated and not have to feel like, if I don't show up, then the Black trans voice isn't there. But also, I'm selling my body at night to pay my rent, but I'm the liaison for the LGBT organization during the day.
If I could piggyback on Dominique's statement, I think it's so important, this foundational understanding and understanding of the community, in that I still remember along with the Department of Justice, going to Jacksonville to speak to JSO, Jacksonville Sheriff's Office, one of the largest law enforcement agencies in the country. And the first thing out of the mouth of one of the senior leaders of that organization was, what makes this so difficult is these women keep putting themselves in harm's way by the job that they do. And I was, my brain blew up, and I jumped in his stuff saying that it doesn't matter what job someone may be doing, they still should not be eligible for being murdered. And that's okay, because they're a sex worker. They put themselves in harm's way. So, well, they had it coming because that's what they're doing. And that's, you broaden that perspective in reference to seeing the community in that way and working through those biases is a foundational piece of making progress in this area. We talk about safety, we talk about inclusion. All that has to be wrapped around criminal justice, education, as well as better understanding the community, and that sex work does not mean that you are totally fine to be murdered in a back alley in the middle of the night and then misgendered by law enforcement the next day.
Yeah, thank you for that, Gina. I appreciate that. And yes, the intersections are so pertinent and crucial, and we can't divorce any of our various aspects of identity from one another. And the reality of systemic racism is undergirding and covering all of this as well. So I appreciate all the ways that we're bringing that in. I wanted to say, obviously we could talk for a very long time about these issues because they're so important and we're so passionate. But as we kind of move towards the next step here, in terms of we want to see growth, we want to see change, we want to see progress and continued progress. We want to honor the progress that's been made because people fought really long and hard for that progress, and we're grateful for it, and we honor them, and we want to continue that work. So in terms of the priorities right now, what do we feel like is the greatest priority? What do we need to be hitting the hardest right now in terms of pushing for change and growth in law enforcement, criminal justice, some intersection there? And Dominique, would you share about that?
Yeah, I think one, to celebrate progress and growth. I think you are seeing more trans folks of color who are in a position to add voice. I think the power of young people who are saying, listen, we've watched several generations kind of fumble this ball as an 80s baby. Like we didn't go as hard as we probably, as we watching these young people just really shift the dynamic and say incredible things that make us uncomfortable, but it's because it's stuff that we really need to be talking about. So I think the wins are seeing young people really be powerful, really move forward. Queer communities having panels like this. We wouldn't have seen this even 5 years ago from a pride-based entity, right? Like, that's real. I think the opportunity for a shift and change is looking at, I will bring it back to this, most people I know who engage in policing, the police are there historically when you call them when there's an issue. I always ask the question, well, how does the community stay safe when the police aren't there? Community. Community is, you see the kids skipping school and you're the auntie that's looking down the street. I'm gonna tell your mama you better get back to school, right? Community is the neighborhood person who's running the grocery store. You know the kid is coming in and stealing candy. Listen, don't do that, put it back. Or let me give you a job. You see the community shift and change and have radical transformational moments in real time when policing is not happening. Why? Because policing, and when I talk about policing, I'm talking about judges, all of that, because they're human. So they're fallible, they can't be everywhere. I want us to invest in community. I want to challenge I want to challenge police officers, police spaces to recognize that talking about defunding policing is not saying that we don't want people to have jobs. We're saying, how can we make sure that money goes into community to activate solutions that are already happening that aren't being funded at all? How do we do that? We're saying that we need to listen to the most impacted. We're saying that putting someone in prison and jail is not the answer for everything. As a person who experienced nearly a decade inside, there are people who were 20, 30 years into a prison sentence for murder who still had not grasped why murdering someone was wrong. And if the goal is to activate us as people to think about how we treat each other and what is good, what is respectful, what is kind, what creates powerful community, the data doesn't show that policing does that. What the data does show is that having conversations does that. What the data does show is that if you have a Black trans person who's in a community thriving, that the community then learns about the experience of thriving Black trans people. And therefore more Black trans people thrive. What the data shows is that when they see a Nathan, when they see a Gina, they come back and say, oh, there is not a monolith of the trans experience. Let me find out more. So I think investing in that community piece is where we have power. I think that's something that can happen all over our world right now, because also we need to recognize that you think of certain areas where in Texas and certain areas where you're not going to be able to walk down and the street is painted in rainbow for Pride Month because they don't even think Pride Month is a thing. You can activate community anywhere. The last thing I will say, let us not keep leaning on the one queer person working in the organization or the one Black person working in the organization or the one trans person working in the organization to fix all of our stuff. To my trans sibling and families, listen, those people are trying to get their check and I respect that. I promise you, one person is not going to change the whole system. Let us stop hanging everything on that to the system. If we can really divest from tokenizing, you want to see a huge shift in trans people? Hire them and they'll talk about how great the experience is. And I promise you, they'll be like, listen, you should come here. That's what we need to see more and more and more. Because we also are in a space where many people are making choices every day to either be a community change agent or make a check. And oftentimes the most oppressed are choosing to not invest that way. And I understand why. Again, I want to thank everyone on this panel for holding space here. I want to thank everyone for having difficult conversations. And I want to thank Florida, like in general, for even talking about this. As a Nebraskan child, I don't think Omaha would ever. I think that's really powerful for y'all to be holding space like this. So I just wanted to thank everyone.
Thank you for that, Dominique. And I think I appreciate remembering that it's not just about changing law enforcement and criminal justice, right? That those are systems, but communities where the beauty and the magic happens. And I appreciate that so much. And then looking from the personal perspective here of folks who have been involved in this progress, Gina and Nathan and Chris and Fred, with being within the system itself and working for change, how does this change happen? You know, definitely the community investment, the things that Dominique mentioned are incredibly important. And how does the system change? Where can people put their weight and their voice and their activism? Whoever wants to go first there.
The answer there is everywhere. So one, Dominique, thank you so much for filling some of my buckets right now with so much of your truth. Everything, that's the centering of what we need to do. Activating community everywhere, right? So that can be in lots of different spaces at lots of different levels. So to reflect back on something Fred said, judges are getting trained, sometimes in INSA courts, sometimes at our local bar associations. But it's if somebody thinks to ask. Different, LGBT liaisons at different law enforcement agencies have more or less lane space given by their chief about how much work they can do, right? Or the local law enforcement organization that exists. If there's a really strong association, more happens. So we have these great pockets in Orlando or South Florida that maybe aren't quite as strong in Tampa or Jacksonville or Tallahassee. It's everywhere, but you have to choose to make it a priority. You have to choose to lean in intentionally. For predominantly white cis-led organizations, you need to understand and acknowledge that racial equity has to be a part of the work, especially within LGBTQ organizations, whether statewide or local, and push to do the work, because that urgency that Dominique talked about is very real. Trevor Project just came out with some new statistics this year about where the next generation is at. And there's a lot of work that needs to be done, and it is absolutely life-saving and necessary. And be honest in your evaluation of your internal systems, right? So if local judiciaries are sort of recognizing, we're not really doing much, then let's challenge ourselves. Ask does your bar association have a D&I committee? Do you have anybody LGBTQ on the committee? Do you have anyone trans? I think there's a lot of opportunity to do more. And I also would challenge you to understand the why is much broader than most folks have sort of recognized. Where do you start the conversation? And I think some of that is what we've all tried to highlight here, that it is so much more than all of that. But also recognize as like an ally in this fight, as Dominique also highlighted, this is exhausting work for trans folks within whatever level we're in, right? And the lift is a lot. If we're the single person coming as a resource, recognize and honor that, and you are in the system, right? You have some ability, I think, to drive that forward. And it shouldn't be passive. It shouldn't be just sort of well, let's call Dominique or Nathan or Gina. It's let's drive this thing forward. Activate communities. I think that was a great, nice way to put that, Dominique. Thank you for that.
Well, I think we were all talking about how important education is in this piece, right? And how important it is to have the right people in the room conducting that education. But it's also important to note that education will lead to policy, but is that policy truly happening in practice on the streets? We see this with major corporations. They score 100% on the Human Rights Campaign scoring. They have great policy, but there's a huge gap between their policies and what's actually happening in the workplace. Yeah. So education, policy, but ensure that practice is going on and it's being inspected, it's being lived, it's being talked about. It's part of the culture of the law enforcement agency.
Yeah, culture.
Yeah, just to add to that and to touch on something that Dominique said earlier, law enforcement, just like pretty much the entire criminal justice system, it is very slow to change, but we do need the people on the ground essentially telling us what it is that they need, the experiences that they've had. And, I'd especially when I heard that they have been telling us, I know and understand that. And I'll be the first to apologize, because I know historically law enforcement has not been really great when dealing with the entire LGBTQ community, not just the trans community, but honestly, especially with the trans community, especially having seen some of that firsthand. It's terrible to see, and we want to change. We want to do better, and especially under the current administration, we do hold people accountable for that. But in order for us to do it, kind of like Gina was talking about, we have the policies in place, but if we don't know that these infractions are happening, it's difficult for us to hold them accountable. So in talking about how people can support that work, just to have the community speak up, talk to a supervisor, and if you feel the supervisor isn't getting it or isn't addressing it, talk to a manager, talk to internal affairs or professional standards, whatever that department has, but continue to speak and continue to tell your story, because until you get through to somebody, that important change, the institutional change, just isn't going to happen. And we need your help to make that happen.
I know I'm repeating myself, or not repeating myself, I'm repeating what the panelists have said, but especially with judges, we might be the slowest to change on the continuum. I think law enforcement is probably even out in front of us. And as I said earlier, we desperately need education, and I hope that that education leads to awareness. You're going to face some resistance because you're dealing with people who are in charge in their own little world from 9 to 5, giving orders and having those orders followed. And sometimes they think they're the smartest person in the room, and so they're a little resistant to the message. But you just have to advocate for change, and that starts through education. Every time I start to speak, my computer freezes up. So every time I start to speak, my computer freezes up. I don't know what's.
Yeah, we can hear you. You're good.
Yes.
But again, with the group of judges, it's education that leads to awareness and advocacy. I mean, there is advocacy that needs to happen. There needs to be political awareness and community awareness. We might be your biggest challenge, judges, because we think we know it all and we clearly don't. Having said that, I have seen progress. It's slow progress, but there has been some progress. In my circuit, the first openly gay judge was elected in the last term. That I can tell you that has changed behavior within our ranks. And that's very important and significant. And so, it's slow progress, but it's important progress. I really think we need, we might be the most educated group in terms of degrees, and yet we need the most education in terms of this issue. And so we need your help to educate and advocate. And it can happen, as someone said, at local bar meetings. It can happen inside of circuits where you approach the chief judge and say, at a lunch meeting, can we make a presentation to the number of judges in your circuit? And then there's also statewide education in Florida for judges. That agenda is crowded because we're teaching new judges, for example, a lot of information about how to be a judge, but there's got to be room for this conversation. When I started, there was almost no education about mental health challenges and substance abuse. And about 70% of our business was driven by mental health challenges and substance abuse addiction. And yet we didn't know what we were doing in that arena. And so domestic violence, there's been a change over the decades about domestic violence. And here is an area where we need to work, and we need your help, and we need to be educated, and then hopefully the system will change. And that certainly, and then the whole area of race in the justice system is a huge conversation that is ongoing. I think there is small change. It's happening way too slowly. But yeah, we're a system that needs a lot of education and a lot of advocacy.
Thank you so much, everybody, for the ways that you've engaged in this conversation. And obviously, this is just one snippet of an enormous conversation that's going on in a lot of places, right? And so I appreciate the real on-the-ground work that each of you are doing to move this forward. And I hope today has been informative to the folks who have been able to join in with us. I want to say special thank you to the folks who have been engaging in the comments. We tried to address as many of those comments that we could get to. But this is one piece of a schedule of events this week. We've got 2 more workshops based in Orlando on Friday. 11:30 is about trans competent mental health care, and 4 o'clock is the intersection of the transgender community and the opioid crisis in partnership with Orange County government. So I want you to know how much we appreciate you. I want to say to our panelists, y'all are just wonderful. And the fact that you're ready to come and share your vulnerability, come and share the areas where you've really struggled to make progress and the areas where you're open to making more progress, that is a huge, huge testimony to the reality that change is possible. And it comes through the deliberate action of people over time and the willingness of people to learn and grow and change. And so thank you for that. Thank you for your time today. We're wrapping up. Any final words?
No, just thank you for holding this important conversation. Work to be done.
Come out to the march Saturday. That is the thing.
March.
and tune into the Torch Awards Friday night virtually and celebrate amazing trans people all across the country who are doing this work. But be there on Saturday at the march because it's going to be a lit experience. So, boom.
Yes, thank you, Dominique. And there's a rally at 1 p.m. at the Northeast Stage at Lake Eola, and the march starts immediately after that at 2 o'clock. And then you'll be done in time for the Pride Parade at 4. So it's going to be a wonderful weekend, and we look forward to seeing you there.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
We are here because we're tired of being unemployed and underemployed. We are tired of only having to engage in sex work. We are tired of being your outreach people and your peer navigators making $10 to $12 an hour. We are tired of fighting for our country on foreign soil and then being told that we are no longer fit to serve. We are tired of our murders going without any justice.